What is up, ladies and gentlemen? Welcome back to FudgeMuppet. My name is Scott. I'm here with Michael and Drew, and today's Elder Scrolls podcast is all about the lesser-known races of beastfolk. So we've picked a bunch, and most of them, I don't think there should be any outside. We're also not going to do the Akaviri ones. We're not going, because we've done Mysterious Akavir, so we're not going to talk about ones from there. So just in Tamriel. And we're just going to go through them in alphabetical order. So which one of you guys wants to start us off with the birdmen of Cyrodiil?
Yeah.
The birdmen who don't even have a name. I just stole it off you, Michael. Sorry. No, well, look, to introduce them, we had Topal the pilot, and he was like one of the Aldmer sailors trying to find old Aldmeris that was lost and accidentally stumbled across Tamriel, and they had no idea where they were going and ended up sailing up the Niben, saw the catfolk running along the waters and whatnot, and they found the current location of the Imperial City, which obviously wasn't there at the time, and found the birdmen.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Who do not have a name because it's been lost to time.
And the thing that's really interesting about the birdmen is that originally it seemed like they could speak to the Oldmer in Old Maris. So they were calling out to them in their own language. But really, they're more just like one of those birds that mirrors speech without actually understanding what they were saying, like a lyrebird or a mockingbird or something like that, which I find quite cool. And then obviously Topal kind of gave them the secret of literacy, taught them to speak their own words and write with their taloned feet. And in exchange, they gave him basically the islands and the area where the Imperial City sits today. So it was a pretty good trade.
Yeah, and then that's how the Aelids, I guess, got founded and started, really, because they started off there and they built their white gold tower and so on. And you can see the Aelids are, they have lots and lots of bird imagery, and they've been described with like beads and sort of feathers and stuff in their, in their dress and so on in the songs of Pelennor. So it's, I guess they took...
There's heaps of stuff with that. And obviously also the Umaril, the Unfeathered, and things like that, who would only have that title if being feathered was the norm, I guess. I mean, there's these theories that the Aelids and the bird people or birdmen are actually related, like biologically, like they were interbred with them. Or there's even a theory that's like they were them, but I don't really like that one.
Yeah, it doesn't stack.
Well, because see, because I mean, I think of the Aelids as getting pretty wacky, but not initially. It was more as their culture developed and started to degenerate that some of the weirder stuff happened. I can't really imagine them actually interbreeding with these, bird type people. But I saw the idea is that they taught them literacy in exchange for this land, and then when they came back to settle it properly, they just ended up enslaving them anyway, and that's part of the reason why they're gone.
Yeah,
completely.
that's one of the theories. So there's one that says that the birdmen were made extinct in general just by the cat demons, or I guess Khajiit ancestors that were also in the area at the time. And then the other idea, I think it's from the Leyawan Coast Guard who speaks to you in Elder Scrolls for Oblivion. And what he says is that he's kind of laughing, saying like, oh, they taught them the secrets of literacy, and it was great because it made them better slaves for the Aelids. So they could have just been slaves and died out. They could have interbred somewhat. There's no reason that they couldn't have. It's just, it wouldn't have been to a significant extent, I don't think.
Well, it depends how much they could, like if like, in the similar ways, like with Khajiit and Argonian stuff is sort of hazy. But like, I don't, like early on, because when the Aelids in their origin, when they first got there, like with Topal the pilot and stuff, like Aelids is the name for the culture that sort of came after. But initially they were like a tributary state of the Somerset Isles, and they sort of adhered to the King of Valenwood and so on. So it wasn't until much later that it kind of like diverged. And so...
Yeah, well, that's what I was getting at as well, because, as much as the Aelids became a very distinct culture of their own, when they were very close to the Oldmer and, they're obsessed with their purity and whatnot, you can't imagine them coming over and being like, yeah, let's mix our genes with these feathery people.
Yeah.
It's like, it's probably a bit of a stretch
Perhaps
at first.
But you never know. You never know. It is interesting to note, though, on the topic of all the references to bird things. So there's the smashed viscera of elven faces, feathers, and magic beads, which were the markings of the Eilidun from Pelennor. And the bull had fallen to a volley of bird beaks. There's a lot of quotes like this, although generally speaking, the elven kind of race in general, they have a lot of bird iconography. Like, I don't know if it is uniquely Eilid per se. Like, if you look at the elven armor in Skyrim, the helmet is basically a bird's head. The shield's like this big feathered thing. Like, there's
it's
feathers
the Oriel,
on everything.
Oriel iconography. They started making Oriel, like envision it as an eagle, and the Aldmeri Dominion symbol being an eagle and so on. But
I imagine them forging their arrowheads almost to look like bird beaks, and what with the feathers on the end. So it's kind of it's a cool way to describe it, metaphorically.
So do you think Umril the Unfeathered could have been called that just because his armor or something was different?
We've had all kinds of conversations about it. I kind of think I thought it might have been because of his differing heritage with his whole like divine father and so on, and then maybe like if you thought about like being feathered is like maybe some kind of like coming of age thing for an Eilid, like, or like trial or something like that, but he's the unfeathered because he kind of never had to do any of that or something like that, or just it's just some way I guess to distinguish him from the rest of Eilids and so on. But I don't think it's meant in some super literal sense. Like feathered could be some sort of cultural thing.
Yeah, and they could also, I've also heard the idea that they killed these birdmen and wore their skins and stuff as cloaks and adorn different things with it, with the feathers and things like that.
I can't remember if it was how he's described in the Songs of Pelennor, whether he's referenced as Umril the Unfeathered there, but there's also the idea that he did have wings and Pelennor tore them off, and then that's why he's now called Umril the Unfeathered.
Okay. Right. Rip the chicken.
But I can't remember if that stands up, just because he might be referred to Imra the Unfeathered in Songs of Pelennor. But that's just another idea.
There's also a third theory, which I'll just put out there because on the Elder Scrolls podcast, we like to talk about every possible idea and not just throw them all in the bin. Although, while I don't think it's likely, there is this idea that it's referring to one of the old Argonian tribes that may have been spread around the place. I highly doubt it. But there is that tribe said to be winged.
The only reason I doubt that is also just the way that the Eilids, all of their iconography and stuff and the descriptions is very like feathered, very, very bird-like, rather than some sort of like, what are they called, like pterodactyl kind of looking thing, if you know what I mean.
Sure, but I'm not talking about the Eilids. I mean just the race of the birdmen themselves. Like the Eilids can do whatever they want with their architecture. It doesn't mean that it's based on the birdmen.
But I'm just saying there's a good amount of like logical conclusion there that they sort of, with the birdmen that were there and all, you can also imagine just like exotic birds and stuff of jungle Cyrodiil, I guess, which could affect their
Oh, for sure.
Well, he's also kind of the crossover point between Meridia and the Aurorans and then the Aelids. So if you imagine the old Aelids were all wearing feathers and whatnot, whereas the Aurorans were golden hued, so they were perfectly golden. They wouldn't have had feathers and things on their armor, which if you can even call it armor, it's kind of just their skin. But then you look at Umril and he's kind of a mix of the two. So he's got like, it almost looks like he's got bird wings, just completely featherless. So it's kind of like the halfway point between the two.
Yeah. Yeah.
But yeah, as I said, I don't think that they are the Argonian tribe, but I would just put it out there as food for thought.
Ultimately, there's not a whole lot. Bird people is just a whole lot of speculation, because really outside Topal the Pilot and then the fact that the Aelids have bird imagery, there's not much to go on about them.
As a bit of description, they were described as brilliant, flightful creatures of glorious colors, feathered men, and as having taloned feet. So they sound like they would have looked pretty interesting. Like, there's also a character in the Elder Scrolls Online who thinks she has what she calls a Cyrodiilic bird person skull, although it's another scholar in her group swears it's a terror bird, which is just a large bird of prey found in northern elsewhere. And I just get the vibe that would be the case as well, seeing as there's no trace, seemingly, of this race of beast folk that have since been exterminated from the face of Tamriel.
Yeah.
Well, I mean, I know we're going loosely alphabetical order, but do you think there's any relation to the Harpies?
No, I don't think so.
No?
'Cause their creation story for the Harpies kind of comes a bit later. And also, I don't know, maybe this is just me assuming, but I kind of get the idea that there are male and female bird people and so on. Like, I kind of get, like, a bit different to, like, do you know what I
for
mean?
sure.
The Harpies.
I mean, they're called the birdmen. Even though,
Yeah,
even though
exactly.
that's usually just used to describe the human
Yeah.
races, like lizard men was, Argonians were called that at one stage, but harpies seem to be entirely like female in their makeup and appearance. But I think we're safe to move on from the birdmen of Cyrodiil
to the Centaurs.
to the centaurs.
Yeah.
So the centaurs, like they always are in every depiction, basically have the lower body of a horse and the upper body of a really strong muscular man, basically.
If you look at the Legends art too, they have kind of done a bit of effort to make their face look a little more like bestial sort of, and it's got like elven-like ears actually, but like they don't look just like a human plastered to the top of a horse.
Yeah.
They kind of look like their own thing, which I like.
They look really cool. And there's I don't know if you're talking about the Elder Centaur card specifically,
Yeah.
but due to that, we actually hear Centaur dialogue. So they're capable of saying a bunch of aggressive lines, like, about how they're going to kill you and whatnot. And they also refer to others as mortals, which kind of implies to me that they, besides just seeing themselves above men, they may live for longer. We don't know what their time spans are like.
It all sort of ties into their connection to the whole old ways thing. Like, they're considered the true followers of the old ways by the conclave of elven forces. But it's kind of... We're in the old ways. The only other real reference we have to these old ways is what the Sigic Order basically talk about, and that's which is even different to how the Somerset Isles sort of keep their purity and so on. Like a more ancient. I think of it as a more like Elnefey type kind of connection and so on. And I would actually wager that if we were to think about this is an interesting discussion we should actually approach with all of these is where do they fit into the whole Elnefey thing? Because with the exception of Argonians, every single race is either old Elnefey or wandering Elnefey and have signed a connection. And I think the true followers of the old ways or something makes me think more old Elnefey, like more closely related, but to elves, but not necessarily. Like they don't have to fall inside that dynamic, I guess. But
yeah, I can agree with that, especially if they look a bit elven in the art. I will actually say on the topic of the old ways, it's interesting that the Nords and the Etmorans kind of have the same thing, like the old ways religion, which is different, but...
I think they're just calling it the old ways because it's their old ways?
Yeah, but I mean, they really say it like the old ways, like the phrase over and over again. They don't just casually throw it away, but that's a completely different thing. So, yeah, just to be clear, we're talking about the Sigic old ways.
Yeah.
And it makes me wonder if perhaps they did master mysticism magic as well, because they were already said to be extremely dangerous on any battlefield, like skilled with bows and spears. I mean, we know how dangerous just a man is on horseback. So when you combine that with a horse and just fuse it permanently and give not just so you don't have to control the horse, you are the horse. So you have a lot of mobility. Like yeah.
Direct mind-muscle connection.
That's
it's interesting that their home is mainly Valenwood now, though I talked about this in the before Elves and Men video, but they were like, you can surmise that they'd probably be spread like right up through Valenwood, up through Clovia kind of area, up through Hammerfell, up into High Rock, and in the Daggerfall games you can see centaurs that are around there. To be honest, they could probably even be in Skyrim, they're just not in the game that we see. But like, I can imagine their numbers dwindling elsewhere because of civilization spreading, and the reason that they've survived along with other beast races in Valenwood is just because of the protection that Valenwood gives them rather than it being their ideal environment. Because when you think of horses, like a big forest isn't exactly its home ground environment. They'd much rather some big plains or something like that,
Well, when you were talking about the creation story, you said that you either come from the Elnathay or the Argonians being the only exception. Are you kind of insinuating that you think they might have the same heritage as the men?
I think men, because I think old Elnathay and wandering Elnathay might encompass more than strictly ideas of men or mer. Just by look at how, I mean, they do call them the men of Akavir. The Sayesi refer to them as men of Akavir, but if they are as serpentine as some descriptions say, that's something that really departs from a typical idea of what a man looks like. If you know what I mean? I feel like there could be other things mixed in there. For some reason, I don't. You know how there's some forces like Nereids or something. That's what they're called. That's how we pronounce it?
Nereids, yeah.
They're sort of more related to kind of earth bones, kind of earth spirit kind of vibe things, whereas for the centaurs I just think their connection with the same old ways that the Sigic Order follow and stuff like that, I just kind of get this idea and also that they're more like a society rather than just this sort of water spirit. I get a different idea about them.
Okay, because I kind of, for me, imagining their origins, it was more of the Ifray creating from the ooze kind of story is what I imagined was their means of coming into the world.
Okay.
Because obviously the Elnathay story doesn't really justify the origins of creatures that are semi-intelligent or not intelligent. So then it's a question of how much intelligence should be considered part of the Elnathay storyline and how much is just a creature. And I kind of associated them more with being creatures that have just kind of developed enough intelligence.
Okay. I kind of like the whole idea of the ooze because, the Bosmer were once, the idea is that they had all of these wildly changing forms and you see relics of that with their little horns and little, bestial details. That maybe the Centaur are another sort of group that came from the same sort of ooze there because they just got kind of stuck in a different form, not related to the Green Pact though, if that makes sense, they kind of came out of it differently. Maybe.
You reminded me of exactly what I was going to say because there's a quote which I'm struggling to find now that essentially said every beast that comes to be on Tamriel comes from a previous wild hunt and things like that. So you can almost imagine that maybe there was a wild hunt in the early times that kind of somehow merged elements of man or elf with a horse, and it kind of came about that way.
Because just to throw out there another sort of reasoning behind sort of a lot of Elnathay derivative for things. If you look at Minotaurs, technically they are from wandering Elnathay because it's a meeting of man and Mora House. If you go with that idea, which is it's pretty. I mean, it's debate in the modern incarnations you can see, but I feel like the way they're written is deliberate anti-Minotaur sort of propaganda because they don't like modern incarnations. The Empire won't like that. We'll get to that later, but just the idea that you could place their connection to the wandering Elnathay men or races of men in the same way I feel like there might be a path for that for a bunch of other beast races.
Well, the interesting thing about their intelligence and stuff anyway, if we're trying to figure out their origins and what they are, is they're intelligent enough in one account to be invited to some revelries in Valenwood. So there's a big celebration with food and drink and dancing and singing. And there's a variety of guests there, like Imga even. But one of them is a family of centaurs, which is quite interesting. And we know they can speak. So they're not just they have their own language as well, apparently called Centaurian.
Well, even in the place, the Elden Hollow beneath Elden Root as a resting place for Minotaurs and Centaurs, that kind of having a formalized funeral spot or even a dying spot or whatever does indicate more intelligent society than just a beast or anything.
For sure. And there's also, if you look at the Daggerfall user guide, it talks about how they have varied personalities. And there's legends of their exploits ranging from the epic to another word, which I don't want to say because I don't want to get demonetized. But, there's...
The pornographic.
Yes, that. Can never be too careful these days. But yeah, so if they have a lot of varied personalities, they were invited to revelries, and they're capable of speech. They can speak Tamrielic, as we've seen with the Elder Centaur, and they also have their own language. They seem intelligent enough.
I wish they were. I can easily imagine them as an enemy out on the Whiterun plains and stuff. I wish they were an enemy type. It would have been a has to sort of animate them and so on. And I can see why they didn't, because remember when Skyrim first released, they didn't even have mounted combat, so they couldn't even kind of like fuse those two things. But you know what I mean?
Yeah. What's their relation with the Reachmen?
With the Reachmen.
Yeah.
Oh, it's just in that mod, it has the Reachmen with centaurs with like some Forsworn stuff, which I kind of like the idea of, because there's already a precedent for Reachmen working with Minotaurs, and then they also like have different, obviously, conceptions about how people sort of look, like hag ravens are revered and so on, these mutated beast-like things. So they're kind of like they don't have like a purity complex in the same way other societies do about the physical form being altered to be more beast-like. So it fits in there, but I don't think there's any strict canon with centaurs. With Minotaurs, they have worked with them before.
Right. I guess I'll also say, which we probably should have said at the start if you didn't say it, all of the beast folk that are lesser known that we're going to be talking about today, it's not going to involve things that were kind of created from a curse, like the hag ravens. You know, like they're specifically a beast race almost. Not
the way to think about it is a species that reproduces and creates more of that species rather than a twisted form. Because otherwise you could kind of go like, oh, like werebeasts, you know, beast folk, because but it's just a curse. It's distinguishing like some big magical change from an actual species that reproduces and creates more of their species.
So talking about reproduction, is there any proof of female centaurs? Or I'm not even sure how to pronounce the female form of centaur, but in the Elder Scrolls, is there any?
I don't think so, not from what I know, but...
Yeah, I'm pretty sure all of the ones you fight in Daggerfall are, you know, just have big pecs and abs.
Yeah, so it's just these big muscly boys oiling each other up, and then you get a baby centaur, I guess.
Yeah, I don't know. I'm assuming there are, just because there are societies of centaur, and you can't really have a society without procreation.
And like I was saying, there was also a family of centaurs present at this supposed celebration. So,
yeah, it's going to be similar to how, like, I'm pretty sure you don't see female minotaurs from memory, but maybe there are some, but still. I reckon we move on to dregs now, because I think we've covered pretty much everything about the centaurs, and the dregs get interesting because we see their various different forms. And if you were playing like Oblivion, for instance, you're probably most familiar with the land dregs. It reminds me of what do they call them? The Acklay in Star Wars Attack of the Clones, that big thing. I remember, like, that's how I felt when I was in the arena fighting them. I'm like, I'm on, like, this was when I was a kid playing it. But in Morrowind, they're more, they're like these aquatic sort of octopus kind of folk. But the land drag is just basically a life stage of it, where they get all aggressive and go to land to mate and make eggs, and then they...
So it's called Kavinasim, but it's essentially their phase in life where they lay their eggs. And it kind of makes sense that, you know, it's essentially water dregs when they're in heat. So they just become, crazed and aggressive in order to protect their eggs. So it's not that they're a different creature. They just kind of go full, like, protecting my flock phase.
Yeah. I actually like the water-based ones more. I find the art style a lot more interesting, like the kind of octopus, almost to me like a squid.
Yeah.
Like,
and the most interesting part about them, so like Dunmer make dreg armor from their carapace, and they like use dreg wax as an alchemical ingredient, and we can mention those in a sec. But the most interesting part is how it intertwines with like Kaima/Dunmer mythology and so on. And also this is referenced by I'm pretty sure it's referenced in the Mythic Dawn commentaries as well, but it's basically the idea of Nirn before all this, perhaps even a previous Kalpa, the dreg ruled all of Nirn in these big palaces of like coral and glass, and that they were led by their chieftain Molag Bal at that time, and that's how he... There's some interesting.
Molag Bal was depicted almost much more crustacean in form, like all spiny, and ultimately, the story of the ruddy man and whatnot. But his shell basically is left behind, and then discovered
by a kid.
Yeah.
So the Mythic Dawn commentary says the Mundux terrene, which is Mundus, was once ruled over solely by the tyrant Dread Kings, each to their own dominion, and border wars fought between their slave oceans. They were akin to the time totems of old, yet evil and full of mockery and profane powers. No one that lived did so outside of the sufferance of the dregs, which is a pretty cool way to imagine how they used to be. And Vivek then says in his sermons, when the dregs ruled the world, the Daedroth prince Molak Bal had been their chief.
And I love the reference, the Tribunal Temple calling them the Ultima of the Sea. Also because of their castles of glass and coral. But if you, the Somerset Isles has all the like that, it has like land coral and stuff around the beach areas and so on. But in previous depictions, you know, the Crystal Tower, and they were like supposed to have all these buildings of glass and so on. It quite literally become the Ultima of the Sea versus like the Lord of the Rings interpretation we sort of get later on. But
yeah, well, there's the theory that they became less intelligent because they were hunted so much for their wax and their shells and whatnot. But you still see like little hints of intelligence, like they'll cut fishermen's lines so they can steal the fish from their nets and whatnot. But I kind of imagine them, you know, I don't know if this is a bit of a stretch, but the idea is that they kind of perhaps endure the Kalpic cycles better than most, in that they're kind of like the same as they were before, only they've lost their intelligence. I almost imagine them kind of like turtles or crocodiles surviving the dinosaur extinction because they're underwater in their civilizations. Perhaps they're not so affected and reset the way...
We never know, though. I guess there's not really been a whole lot of deep diving into the oceans and so on, but there's a possibility of more intelligent dreg civilizations living on underneath.
I don't know. I've done some diving in Skyrim and found absolutely nothing. You know,
some slaughterfish.
You know, I also did a huge dive around the water of the Shivering Isles just because I thought that that's somewhere no one would have explored. Like no player would have explored like the most off reach of the sea in the Shivering Isles. I found absolutely nothing.
Cue 1,000 comments saying that, yeah,
No
I've done
way.
exactly that.
I don't believe it. But yeah, the dregs are scary, especially when you look at their egg laying and how they can actually sense where their eggs are if they go missing, and like often they're harvested by fishermen and things like that, and they're prized. Can you imagine how scary it would be to steal a dreg egg and then they just come for you in the night? Like, especially if you live on a farm, it's not like you're up in some castle. They just migrate over to wherever you've taken that egg. Yeah. Oh, that would be so creepy.
It's so interesting that phase, they're like going after you in that like land drag form, and they're such like, it's like their attack form kind of.
High libido form.
Yeah, but it's funny how that's taken so literally that they become... like they're actually more intelligent, than they become crazy low intelligence, like just sex-driven kind of crazy animals.
They're horny. They've got horny brains, so they're just not smart anymore.
Yeah, until that phase is over, and then imagine having that phase and then returning back to the sea and kind of regaining your intelligence after all that crazy stuff you just did.
It's kind of like puberty, isn't it?
Yeah,
it's like waking up on Sunday morning hungover, just
yeah 100%.
But like they're pretty. I like also the shock. It's shock resistance and stuff too, isn't there? And oh no, shock attacks.
The idea that they shock attacks, but the idea is that they kind of develop it naturally as opposed to magic. But at the same time, there's no real proof one way or the other.
For some reason, I still go with the non-magic explanation. Just in my head, it makes...
Well, it works in our world as well, doesn't it? Like, you know, jellyfish and I'm sure certain crustaceans have similar type of abilities, you know, if you know what I mean. Not quite so like casting Palpatine shockwaves, but you know.
Yeah,
for sure. And it's funny how they're called billies. It's just the
land
most...
dregs.
It's just, land dregs. It's just the most Australian thing I've ever heard.
Yeah,
we would call dregs billies if they lived here.
Absolutely. But I think that's I mean, I'm just trying to see if there's anything else.
I can tell the story of the Ruddy Man a bit more.
I was just going to say, what do you think about this? Some scholars argue that the land drag is a distant relative of the true drag from further back on the evolutionary timeline, or perhaps even related to Spider Daedra. That sounds like a bit of a meme.
I was with you until you said related to Spider Daedra. They definitely could be related to an older dreg that was more intelligent. overall, and like we talked about. But the idea of them being related to Spider Daedra to me just feels like nah.
Yeah.
It's like centaurs are described like, oh, they have the top half this body and that. It's like, are they related to Spider Daedra? It's like, no.
Yeah. Well, hit us with the Ruddy Man.
So basically, Molag Bal was like a giant crustacean, or was in that form. And when the dead carapace of Bal was dropped into the world from his interactions with Vivek, this Kaima child from Nissus, is that how you pronounce it? I always say Nissus, wore it to scare his village, like, oh, I'm wearing this shell, but instead became the Ruddy Man, which is like this really, how would you describe the Ruddy Man? Just this creepy...
Yeah, well, like, it's all mythological, but there is this ruddy broodmother thing which adds more to it, which we can talk about. It looks kind of like a land drag fused with Molag Bal's face. But, yeah, the carapace taking over the body. It's kind of a weird, like...
we need to see the concept art. The concept art's really cool.
Yeah. It's kind of like an unintentional mantling kind of vibe thing, you know what I mean? Because Molag Bal's sort of... will kind of takes over this child. The child's no longer really a part of the picture. Then there just becomes this Ruddy Man. And then there's this massive battle, and this is what creates the West Gash region. Vivek battling the Ruddy Man, which is one of his infamous battles. And I like that even when roaming that region now, apparently you can sometimes hear the like screeching of Vivek's sword across the carapace of the Ruddy Man, and you can hear like echoes of their battle like thousands of years later, and it's pretty cool.
And no doubt Vivek was victorious and then gave the carapace to the queen of the Dreg. So there was like a Dreg queen. Vivek's like, here's the carapace. I believe it was given to God, but eventually the Ruddy Man came back for a second round, and then that time he decided not to give the carapace back, and instead gave it to the devout and loyal mystics of the Number Room, who made it into a philosopher's armor.
One thing that's kind of interesting about that is it's the Queen of the Dreg has kind of bitten her race in the arse there, because they've, now that the Vivek has essentially just made it typical to use carapace armor for the Dunmer in general, the second time rather than giving it back, that probably really upped the amount of Dreg being hunted off the coast of Morrowind. So, and in a way, like causing them to go close to extinction or unintelligent.
Yeah.
So it's like it's bitten themselves in the arse.
It's also interesting that their chief, like they're associated with Molag Bal and so on, but like Mehrunes Dagon was involved in the sort of like revolution there as well against the tyrant kings of the Dreg and so on. Like it's just it's an example of a direct conflict between, Molag Bal and Mehrunes Dagon, and that's kind of where Mehrunes Dagon was created for, right? In the commentaries.
Yeah. In the bowels of Lig, because the Dreg kings were getting too crazy. So he's like, Mehrunes Dagon is just chaotic neutral. He'll take out whoever's on top, essentially. He's a tool. He's just got serious tall poppy syndrome. He's just got to snip who's ever at the top. But there was this Ruddy Broodmother's character in ESO, like monster, really. And, it's not necessarily literally the Ruddy Man or anything like that, but it is a land drag that looks similar to Molag Bal in shape and so on, and you kill that in ESO.
Yeah, they're very scary. Honestly, one of the most intimidating looking things I could imagine fighting in real life.
I'd say one of the coolest races, even though there's not a great deal to talk about with them, compared to the major races.
They have. It's because they've actually got a really cool mythology around them. They're involved in the Kaima stuff, in the Mythic Dawn commentaries, and they're both so good anyway that it's gonna make them seem heaps cool.
And they ruled all of Tamriel supposedly, so there's a lot of stuff there. I guess, does anyone else have anything to say, or shall we move on to the Harpy?
I reckon we can move on to the Harpies.
All right. Well, the Harpies are basically these huge female humanoid birds, I suppose, who are very aggressive. Super aggressive. They lay eggs, they have nests, they pretty much like everything a bird would like, like rocky cliffs and crags that facilitate nesting, and they feast on flesh no matter what kind of like a scavenger, whether it's a week old or it's fresh, they'll eat it. And very scarily, they're known to kidnap, mate with, and destroy human males.
Well, it's interesting too, because you don't know how, like, outside of that, how do they, breed? Because we don't really see any male harpies, and I do like the idea that they're these primitive matriarchal sort of groups, and they have their own little language, but like, I don't know. To me, matriarchal sort of implies, like, women on top, right?
Yeah.
But as opposed to the men that are in the group as well, if you know what I mean.
But I don't think there are any men in the group.
But that's what's interesting. Yeah, that's what I'm sort of saying. Like, I wonder what the...
Well, it could perhaps... I mean, unless this is obviously implied, but they breed with mortal men that they capture and do that with.
It can't be that hard to find some candidates, I imagine. After a few too many meads or sujamas or something, someone's going to be like, yeah, screw it, take me away.
It's just, I just found it interesting that the reference to matriarchal seems like a funny thing to sort of, to make sure you make that distinguishment when there is no other option in their species, if you know what I mean. Like,
I think it could just be used to describe the fact that they're all female and that the elder female is the one the most revered and looked up to and stuff like that.
Well, there's a quote, it's like, so in terms of biological functions, harpies mirror those of common birds. They craft nests, a cluster of rocks, arrange branches, moss leaves, etc., all that kind of stuff. They lay eggs, bring back food for their young. They huddle together in simple matriarchal societies, crowding around and venerating the oldest or most powerful of the fold. They feast off flesh, don't care about the type or quality. So they're kind of like got that vulture element to them, like carrion. And they're very territorial, have infected claws, and they favor scraping attacks to the face. Elder harpies have been known to employ magic.
Yeah.
And these are all things that kind of, like, obviously it makes it sound it is a bit of a society beyond just, like, a group of animals. They have this little bit of extra to them. And I like the idea that they go and, find, like, I don't know, how do they do it? Like, trick men into it? Maybe there's a magical element to it.
Maybe, but I mean, they're also pretty physically imposing. I don't know how much trouble they'd have. Like, they're very powerful and they attack in groups, so I don't know. I also, by the way, I looked up matriarchal, and there's like two main definitions. One of them's what you're just saying, where it's like women lead the society. But then there's also a second one where it actually says denoting an older woman who is powerful within a family or organization, like specifically denoting an older woman. So, that could just be the fact that they are led by the oldest harpy among the group.
Yeah. Plus this is all written by, it's written probably by humans. So they're kind of just imposing our idea of what a matriarchal archetype is like. But then there's also, I looked into it a little bit because I was curious if there was any way or chance there was any relation to the birdmen or similarities as well. But they have a rudimentary language made up of shrieks and warbles, amplified by small wattles beneath their chins. But then I read that they've communicated with humans, but couldn't find any actual evidence of that. I don't know if in-game there's something different, but in lore text, there's no example of them ever speaking to humans that I could find. So I'm not sure if that's a mistake or whether I just didn't find it.
I know, like, this is a weird thing, but they're not all just vicious and hate everyone, basically. So there's actually a story of an Argonian having a relationship with a harpy. Like a non-violent one.
Right.
Yeah, so basically, I'll read you the story. 4 months ago, I was exploring just off the shores of Glenumbra looking for any sunken items that I could sell when I overheard the loud cries of a harpy. I came ashore to help. To my surprise, I did not find some stray tourist under attack by a flock, but the reverse. A single harpy matron, the ones with dark feathers and jewelry, so there's another societal example that they have jewelry, was being robbed by 3 red guards, not just of her finery, but of her eggs. That's in caps. As a male Argonian, this sent me into a rage. After driving off the trio, the matron had rewarded me, ... quite affectionately. I have been visiting her each week, and each time I leave, she seems even sadder to see me go. I have made up my mind to make this relationship permanent. While I know how others will see it, I'll willingly take their insults. But my greatest concern is that the goddess of affection will see our love as blasphemous or tainted. And then there's an answer, basically explaining how Dibella just sees, no matter the seed, if the shoot is nurtured with love, will not the flower be beautiful? So they're not just angry birds, They're not just Drew's favorite mobile game of all time.
It's interesting seeing Argonian worried about Dibella's opinion.
Well, I guess an imperialized one.
Yeah.
But yeah, I don't know. And there is the whole origin story, but this is it's hard to distinguish like myth from fact in the Elder Scrolls in general. But that they were once a group of cruel and beautiful Daedra worshippers in Laneland, and they were transformed by a magic robe.
Yeah. So the story with that is basically that they come to a castle, I assume, where there's a baron, and they craft lies, curses, murders, and suicides to hurt the people of Laneland, using their beauty as a weapon to drive men to mayhem. And then their leader seduces the unnamed Baron of Laneland and is about to force him to commit suicide to prove his love. When the Baroness arrives, the Baroness tricks this leader into wearing a beautiful white robe from the Baroness's closet, and after putting it on, the trap is sprung, the robe's magical, and transforms the leader into a giant black bird. And then the Baron slays the giant bird, calls in the cook, feeds it to the other followers. And now Laneland Castle has turned into an orgy-filled den of decadence. And at the height of their frenzied debauch, the cook arrives with an enormous roast to keep the energy high. They eat it, they get told it's their leader, and they scream and caw, and suddenly they too are transformed by the magic of the robe into harpies, vicious half-bird creatures. So if this is true, they almost fit into that category we were talking about of like cursed things. But given the fact that they now have eggs and carry on breeding new harpies, it's like they are a proper beastfolk creature.
It's a cool story, but
plus it is a play, so it's heavily dramatized.
The story is said to have changed, and continues to change as time goes by, and there's all these different versions of the story, but they all kind of say the same thing, just in slightly different ways.
The mythology, as is usually the case, is really, really cool and way cooler. But I feel like it could be a case where there is a real boring explanation that they are just some kind of centaur-like origin creature just from ages ago.
It's interesting. The leader in this story is called Noctira, and you could easily look at that and kind of get Nocturnal from it, who is usually portrayed, as holding two black crows and being this beautiful but dark woman. There's seems to be some relationship there, at least in the tale. Yeah.
Well, let's. I think that's pretty much everything on harpies. We good to move to Imga?
Yeah, I'd say so.
Drew, you want to start us off on the Imga?
Did you bring your cape?
The Imga is
Where's your cape?
The Imga is another one of the intelligent races from Valenwood, so their origin's always going to be a bit obscure. But the best way to describe them is the kind of little apes who dress up in capes with dueling swords, and they very much idolize the elves, which kind of gives the impression that they're very not intelligent. But then again, there's an example of an Imga who kind of ascends to a really important place in Imperial society, which kind of turns that on its head. But
it's funny that that's their cultural sort of general archetype, or at least in the modern days, is that they are this sort of, they really like the high elves, and they sort of emulate them and powder their faces and try and appear more pretty and elven kind of thing. But at the same time, one of the greatest prophet of anti-elven rhetoric ever existing was an Imga named Maruk.
Yeah.
And he's supposedly Alicia came to him in his dreams or so, and in a vision, and then he set forth the Elysian doctrines, and he basically spurred on the transition of the early sort of Elysian Empire, turning it into this sort of religious empire where religion and political matters are one, and then screwing over Cyrodiil for thousands of years. Well,
and that's where the Maracati selectives come from as well.
Yeah,
his
exactly.
Name, Maruk.
Yeah,
and he's also the one with the law, pretty savage law, right? who wrote everyone is guilty until proven innocent. Like that was one of the rules that they had.
It's interesting that stands till today.
Supposedly.
Like that it's still the way that law operates in imperial territories.
I feel like there's examples where that's not the case. I just feel like there's been like quests and things where it's like looking for evidence or stuff like that.
Yeah, but you can still have evidence to prove you're not guilty.
Yeah, that's true.
It's just you have to do it. If you don't prove you're not guilty, you're gonna get.
Yeah, but anyway, the Imga in general are super wacky, I guess, in terms of their personality. Like imagine these apes, walking around and they have these really deep voices, but then they're trying to speak all like posh with perfect enunciation and manners and things like this. And apparently as well, the Ultima kind of find them funny. Like they don't see the imitation as like, respectable. So. I can't imagine they would. And they give themselves titles that they use when talking as well to the elves, like Baron or Duke, but they don't actually own any land. And as we were saying, they have capes that they perfume the corners of to hide the smell of men, but they're kind of pretending that they find the smell of men to be really like gross.
It's a funny sort of thing, because you could sum up at least that aspect of the Imga as like monkey see, monkey do. Like they just copy the elves, but it's all the most like superficial elements of elven society and stuff. Like it's just a sort of it also makes it, in my head at least, funnier that they're just like these monkeys just copying, like, I'm just imagining like a monkey in a fez, like riding a tricycle. Like that's the kind of vibe I get in part. But I feel like that is also a bit of an overstatement in how many of them necessarily do that. Like you don't necessarily get the idea that they are like, so there's the whole part where, now this is convenient ESO lore for you, why the Imga aren't in Valenwood. And the reason is because these ape men went to look for Falinesti, which had also conveniently disappeared just before the events of ESO. So because they all just went to Falinesti, and now the real reason is, they just didn't want to program and make Imga and stuff in Valenwood at the time, at least.
Nor a moving tree, right?
Yeah, exactly. But it's interesting that, because that is lore now, is that they went to Falinesti, which sort of, it's a pretty tight with the Wood Elves, if you know what I mean, like this big moving tree city. Like it sort of has a bit of a connection, not. You know what I mean?
Yeah, and like I said anyway, in that story, the Imga are said to have been there at the celebration with Wood Elves, Centaurs, Imga. So they were pretty integrated into the society. And they've said to they have been said to have been around for a really long time. Same as the Centaurs. I don't know if that was mentioned, but they're ancient and always have said to have been there.
It's interesting. I'll just two things. We'll bring up, like, because we mentioned this in the mysterious Akavir thing, that they might have, the only other ape people we know of or heard of are the Tang Mo, which are like the monkey people of the Thousand Monkey Isles in Akavir, and whether there's any form of relation. But also the idea that in Valenwood there is this god called Zen, which was might have been of Akaviri origin, according to the book Varieties on Faith, which could be an interesting idea that they were once from that area, came and changed. But one thing I also want to throw out there is in that pocket guide to the Empire 3rd edition, which is the one that says about all of these races that were here before men, the only caveat there is it depends what, that is obviously going with the very sort of like typical migration kind of theory. Whereas the other, because Khajiit mythology and Wood Elf mythology both place them there at the whole time. Like they're either the ooze that gets transformed or the Khajiit get turned by Azura into the cat people. And those cat demons were there when Topol arrived. And then you throw in other things like, unsure whether the snow elves were always there or the Dwemer were always there, because there is no concrete like A to B from the Somerset Isles sort of transition. So, you just got to look at that one with a grain of salt when they say everyone's there before, because it could have been they've been there forever with the Wood Elves and stuff. Like it's, you know what I mean? Or maybe before the conception of Wood Elves. Yeah. Before they were like this ooze or something.
For sure. I mean, the text just says they were there even before the Wood Elves were there. So we just don't know.
Yeah.
We just don't know. And it's anyone's guess as to how different races got where they were, really.
Yeah. And, I mean, the last little bit of thing about them is, these calliope, an arboreal rodent, which they eat. They jump up and pick them from the perches of trees.
Yeah, I guess the thing there to note, which is interesting about Imga biology, is like real life. They're very dexterous and good at climbing, and they basically climb up the trees and then jump for the calliope on the most slenderest of branches.
I sort of imagine them like basically just a more slim, slightly more humanoid version of a gorilla. Is what I get. Yeah.
To me, the funniest thing about the Imga is just given the description we've given of what they're like as a race, that they caused such a drastic thing to happen in terms of an actual dragon break was caused basically by an Imga, which is kind of funny to me because the Middle Dawn, where they try to separate Akatosh from Auriel, was the Murakadi Selective, so that's Marok. Of the Imga. So it's just kind of funny. Like, why does he get the vision out of everyone? Or is he just a kind of a con artist who just wanted to do some
maybe it's more of a modern thing to be so like admiring the elves so much, because like Marok like naturally would have associated himself more with the races of men, and like as an ape, and that's kind of like, you know, and we naturally do because of our like evolution theory when we go like, you know, there. You know, we're related to gorillas and chimpanzees and stuff, but as opposed to the elves. But because obviously the anti-elven rhetoric he had didn't include like Imga.
But would that idea of kind of being related even occur to humans
this
on Tamriel?
This was my next little thing I was going to segue into. Old El Nefeh or Wandering El Nefeh. Like that's kind of like if you were trying to sort of to suppose where they're from, or they might not necessarily fall into that.
Could they have been made from the ooze, like Drew's theory about the centaurs?
Yeah.
I mean, possibly.
See, I lean more towards that with pretty much every beast race in Valenwood and beyond, really.
Yeah.
But yeah, it's just so hard to say because it ends up being a question of intelligence and how much intelligence seems to derive from the El Nefeh versus just being a beast.
Well, the other thing too is, I guess, could be is if they are some kind of derivative or relative of the Tang Mo in Akavir, and that, which also brings the question like, what are all the other races classify like El Nefeh or because really the old El Nefeh versus wandering El Nefeh is those who had like Aldmeris, or as it was called on El Nefeh, versus the ones who were scattered and then tried to come back and were told, no, you're not coming in. And then a war started about it, which then sundered the continents, and the wandering ones were left to the lands of Akavir and Yakuta and Atmora and so on. Whereas the old El Nefeh had what was left of Aldmeris, which was Tamriel.
Yeah, well, I guess I was wondering, like, how on earth could the Imga get from Akavir across to Tamriel? But I guess when the El Nefeh Wars were happening, it was all one big landmass. So they could have just walked it before it was sundered and new oceans were created and whatnot.
Or he just had he slammed a Yogo and got on his Yogo like waterboat. And
I don't think anyone's going to know what a Yogo is.
I'll put it up.
Yeah, okay.
Just so you know.
That's it. And just flew over.
Obscure reference.
That's our official theory.
Yeah.
It's also interesting with the Imga that there's no like remnant of their society or anything. Like there's one of the things where it's like Lady Clarice Laurent answers your questions, and it's basically saying that it's interesting that there's an absence of artifacts in like from Imga. Like they should still be around making or using tools. Like why are there no signs of them, even if they've left?
My one thing, I guess, if you think of them more like beast-like in the way that they can just, you know, in terms of like to live, they can just wander around the jungle and eat the rodents and stuff they want or whatever they eat in their natural environment. But then they can just kind of piggyback off all of the other groups because there's other civilizations around them. Yeah. In the same way that, like, you know, you have like, in Africa, you'll have like, you know, tribes that in terms of technology they've just jumped from a spear to an AK-47 because people have AK-47s and they can just get access to them.
Yeah, for sure.
Instead,
well, that happened with the Centaurs. The Centaurs kind of just claimed a bunch of Imperial like outposts and things, I think, in Valenwood.
I thought you were about to say the Centaurs got AK-47s. but yeah, 100%. And I guess as well, if they're nowadays... kind of like a race that copies other races and imitates the Altmer, a lot of the things that they would be using and wearing are probably elven in origin anyway. Like they're not like wearing Imga clothes.
Yeah,
they're
exactly.
wearing elf clothes that I don't know how they would make them fit. Maybe they do a custom fit, but based on the concept art, it looks like that'd be rough.
But yeah, I think that about wraps up Imga, so we could move on to the Lamia.
Lamia? Is that how you say it?
Lamia.
I say
Yeah.
Lamia. We got 3 different pronunciations going on.
In Greek mythology, they're just child-eating snake women called Lamia.
Lamia.
So I guess that's just the
Just sounds a
inspiration
little too
for
close
it.
to labia. For
Yeah.
me.
So
Like,
Yeah, I mean, when I did a video on some of these races, I like specifically made sure I got it right, so I didn't get crucified.
Right.
yeah.
But
Right.
yeah. Look, the thing is, at the end of the day, with Elder Scrolls and any fictional universe, I like to pronounce things the way that I like to pronounce them. So, like, I still say Aelid, even though I get told it's Aelid. ESO confirmed it's Aelid.
yeah.
So it's like, I like
Yeah.
Aelid.
Yeah.
Whatever.
But
I say
yeah.
Lamia.
I mean, the thing as well is in Elder Scrolls Online, they just do whatever they want. They're chaotic.
But yeah, about the things themselves, they're basically another group kind of similar to the Harpies in the way that they're exclusively female from what we can see. But they're these big serpentine, amphibious women snake people. But what's interesting is they're specifically noted as quite intelligent. They can speak Tamrielic, cast magic, and so on. They're not like the sort of Harpies, which is like a step above beast. They are like a proper culture, I guess. And they've seen, you see jewelry and stuff on them in ESO, and they do have their own sort of religion. This, entities with like the Egg Mother and the Great Egg.
Yeah.
Very, very complex mythology. But
It kind of reminds me of Argonians in a way, like eggs and focus on that as well.
Yeah.
Not saying they are Argonians. Although, interestingly, if you look at their names, they do look a little bit more Mesoamerican. Like, a little bit.
yeah.
And they also have a similar philosophy to that of the modern Argonian as well. Like, they choose not to erect permanent structures or cities of their own because, there's no point. Although that's more so they can just occupy the ruins left behind by man or mer. And also venerating, like, eggs and that kind of theme.
Yeah.
They don't. Yeah. They do look a bit more like. There's this idea that they could be like a hist experiment, like the hist tried to uplift a snake, but it doesn't really explain why they're all female, unless the hist had some interesting designs in mind. They also, interestingly though, it also what goes against that, and again it's just food for thought. But the Daggerfall ones are way more. They're literally just a naked woman with a snake bottom half, like a snake mermaid. But then in Elder Scrolls Online, they're just like all serpentine looking.
Anything sort of pre-Morrowind, I don't take too seriously in their physical look because, like, I don't literally believe that, like, there were mages running around in bikinis with hoods either. Like, their whole, like, art style of Daggerfall and stuff was very...
super old school.
Very Pulp Fiction vibe, like fantasy and stuff, like those old artworks with like chainmail bikinis and stuff. Like that's the kind
with
of
Conan the Barbarian leading them, and things like that.
Yeah,
100%.
But and I think it's obviously more inventive than newer incarnations of them.
Oh,
but interestingly, also led by a queen, which obviously indicates I guess there's like queen ants and stuff, but it does, combined with their intelligence and so on, it insinuates there's a little bit of a societal structure and so on. And that they prefer to occupy ruins left behind, man and mer. But I don't know how much they actually effectively use them, or they use them just as like houses, like, staying places. Like, I don't know if they decorate.
Oh, I just think the idea generally, is like, why build something if there's already these environments that we can inhabit and suit us perfectly? I mean, like some other races, they are cold-blooded and they like lounging in the sun. Like, they're snakes. They don't need that much. Although, like you said, they are intelligent. They just don't desire to build like grand societies and things like that.
I love that they're just like a snake, eat their prey whole, and have this like big distended stomach, and that's like Yeah, it's just something extra creepy. I think being eaten whole by anything is like really vor.
I knew you were going to say it. I was waiting for it.
I started thinking about that, and it's going to seem really weird because I brought it up at the start of the fictional universe video, and then I'm like, oh man, I love the idea of eating the prey whole. Ooh. It's like, yeah.
But yeah, they are interesting. There's, again, with the society thing that I was saying, there's a quote that's saying, you must be from one of these societies, basically, which has led local models to conclude that building equates to advancement of some sort. You know, like, that they don't necessarily see building a society as more advanced.
Well, here's one thing to throw in too is how do they breed? We know they have eggs and stuff, but like, according to fables, they can interbreed with other mortal races. But if they're all described as female, it's the same sort of Harpy problem. Like what?
Oh, I assume that they're
does the
actually
deed?
kind of like hermaphrodites, really.
Oh, that's common. Yeah, for
because
lizard type.
There are some snakes that are, so I assume they can just kind of like produce their own eggs and protect them and things like that.
I think that's a reasonable conclusion, just because it kind of fits the reptile sort of theme.
Yeah, like everything's based on a snake.
Yeah.
So one could only assume that that's how that all works, you know. And by the way, one last quote I've got on that same topic of civilization. It's the human and elves so silly. They set up city after city, surrender to struggle and discord, and succumb to the scourge of strife. The sequel, expanses of ruins, all set for snatching. It's simple. Edifice assembly is for suckers. So there you go.
Yeah, so it does sound a lot like modern Argonians, doesn't it?
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, while we're talking about Black Marsh and the Argonians, let's talk about the Lilmithit, the Vulpine foxfolk of Black Marsh that lived near the areas of Lilmoth and Blackrose.
Well, I saw your notes before. Fox people dead. That's it.
Yeah, they gone.
Fox people gone.
So the most interesting part, like besides you can imagine what they look like, some sort of furry fox thing, but what the main interesting part of it is they're specifically referred to as a nomadic tribal group, who left few enduring signs of their existence. But this might give us a little insight onto how they actually got there or where they come from or so on. Because by inherently being nomadic, that kind of opens up travel as more of an option. But like as a beast race, like we know Khajiit, well, at least the general idea is that they came from elven stock initially, and that's in all of their mythology and so on. I see no real reason to disbelieve it. It makes sense in proximity to the Bosma and all that. But where did these fox folk come from?
Yeah.
In that regard, like what Elnefey, where are they? Old Elnefey, wandering Elnefey.
Well, see, just off the top of my head, the idea that they're in some way related to the Khajiit doesn't really make sense to me beyond the fact that they're furry. Yeah, because they're, like as vulpine creatures, they're closer to dogs than they are to cats as well. It's like, I don't know. I don't see them as being related to the Khajiit, but at the same time, there's so little info on them.
I mean, just to throw it out there, by the way, is the Nahartan flu in the Second Era basically wiped out all the diversity there was that wasn't Argonians in Black Marsh in the Second Era. So that's why they don't exist anymore.
Who named them as well? Because they do have the same like name ending as the Khajiit.
Well, apparently they founded this. Well, apparently they founded the settlement of Lilmoth and Blackrose, but they were... Lilmithit means one who is from Lilmoth, the settlement. So...
Yeah. I mean, I call them Lilmithit just because of the Khajiit. Like,
yeah. Lilmithit. Whatever, that makes sense. But, I don't buy necessarily the Khajiit relation. I don't think they have to be. It's possibility, but the forms all of the Khajiit forms are really It's like, why? Oh, because Azura made them, and they abide to the phases of the moon.
Yeah, they're tied to the moon. That's the thing.
Fox wasn't included in there,
Yeah.
Unless it's Azura's first experiment, and she just did it. Like, that just sounds so, like... It's just such a weak thing. And I feel like if they explored them in game ever, they would get a better, mythology and, like, more interest to them. Like,
well, that's
a
the
bit
thing.
more.
Out of all of the lesser known beast folk that we're talking about in this podcast, they have the least amount of information on them. They're just vulpine creatures.
It's funny how people. I think the only reason people like get excited by them is that they're just fox people.
Yeah, 100%.
And that's it. Like, outside of that, like, I mean, the Lamia or however you pronounced it have more mythology and a society, like, details about them.
Yeah.
Like, the little moth is basically just fox people dead in Black Marsh.
Yeah.
That's about it. There's not much. I'm sure.
Yeah, that does pretty much sum it
You
up.
could put an emoji on the end or something to give it some more flavor, but that's about it. Fox people.
Or like a
then.
tears emoji or something.
Yeah.
I can't, but look, they just throwing out there that the nomadic emphasis there does mean they could have been from somewhere else originally, maybe. So,
Well, I perceive Lil Muff and the name Lil Muffet to be a name given to them by
Yeah, same.
elves, not by themselves. It's not what they would have called themselves. So yeah, you can't even really make conclusions based on the
For
names.
sure, especially as a nomadic group, why would you name yourself out of one of the places that you kind of built a settlement at?
yeah. I think it's just that, it's just what they got known for once they made the settlement. And then that's where they sort of stayed. But
although it is
I guess,
interesting as a nomadic group that they were all wiped out by this flu. You'd think that some would be spread out in further places that may not have. I know it ravaged like everywhere, but you'd think there could be some survivors.
yeah.
But not.
Well, it's also the case with all the humans there as well, isn't it? That the only surviving humans maybe sailed away on a ship of the Koffringi.
Yeah,
Because I think that's
other
where
than
it was.
that-
That's where it came from, wasn't it? I'm pretty sure.
Yeah,
Black
it was.
Marsh.
The idea is that it was created by a Argonian shaman.
Yeah.
Is the leading
And all the
theory.
Argonians were immune. And they need to bring back stronger... I know we've said this before, but stronger racial bonuses and stuff. I really didn't like how in Skyrim they watered down the Argonians' poison and disease resistance.
I don't even think
stuff.
they didn't even have poison resistance. It was 50% resist disease. Because it used to be 75% resist disease and full-on immunity to poison in the previous games.
Yeah.
And that makes so much sense for the Argonians. And it kind of like, you're like, yeah, that's cool. Even though poison's not the most common damage type, it was still like a interesting racial trait.
In Morrowind, they were 100% immune to poison and 75% resist disease.
Yeah, it's the same in Oblivion, I'm pretty sure.
Oblivion had a solid one too. I do remember that. But yeah, Skyrim's was definitely weaker. All it was 50% resistance to disease.
Yeah, so they just got rid of the poison thing, which was its main thing before. But
I don't see the point in balancing races in RPGs. It's like, does it matter if one is more overpowered or nerfed? And it's kind of part of the fun.
It's like everything, because if you look at like the Dark Elves' resistance now is 50% to fire, but it was 75% to fire in Morrowind. I'll just correct with Nords, but I can't remember if Nords are completely immune to frost or if it was just 75%. But yeah, they're completely immune to frost and they have a 50% resistance to shock. Like that makes them a lot more hardier and metal sounding, as like, it makes sense how they can all walk around bare chested in Skyrim. And
For sure.
but
Anyway, let's get on
We'll
to
get derailed
Minotaurs.
all right, Minotaurs.
Man bulls or bull men.
The best beast race.
Yes.
But
Explain.
all right, so they were I'm going to dismiss all of the later things that are sort of like, oh, the Minotaurs were just a normal beast race, because that's the more boring explanation. The typical one is that the famed mythological stories of Elysia and Morrowhouse and Pelennor and all that. Morrowhouse was this sort of... People interpret him differently as looking like a Minotaur with wings, or he's described as a winged man bull. But some people like to envision him as just a bull, which I think is cool with wings, but like in the Pelennor vid and stuff like that. But anyways, he, did the dirty with Elysia. They fell in love and they made a kid, and that kid was Belhazar. And he is the second emperor of the Elysian Empire that was founded with Elysia. And then there were plenty of... Either Morrowhouse kind of went around doing like lots of other mating, or they were all Belhazar's children. But there's basically, he was supposed to be the first Minotaur, Belhazer. And then after that, there were many more that followed. And I really love that in the early days, the Minotaurs were really intertwined with the Empire, with the Elysian Empire. They were staunch defenders of Elysia, and they were like kind of like these revered warriors, which I really love the idea of it, especially with the connections to Morahouse and stuff. But it also gives you such an ancient feel, like when you think like all of those ancient societies that revered cows and stuff, and or aurochs or whatever, or just basically these horned bulls because of husbandry and stuff and what that brought them. But it's just it gives a more ancient feel to it, and I just love the idea of these Minotaurs being these staunch defenders of Elysian Empire back then. But obviously, as sort of Marok came along and stuff like that, anti-elven sentiment, they were treated like beasts later on. But it's interesting that they instinctually seem to have this kind of connection to old Elysian ruins, where they actually kind of like congregate and stay around these areas. And it's like this sort of like, on some deeply instinctual level, it's almost like some connection back to Belhazer and to their father Morahouse and stuff, as this sort of like, or Elysia. Like they all have that kind of, that blood, whether diluted or not. But I like that sort of... thing.
It's similar to why I like the Dreg. Is the idea is that there's, you know, they've degenerated in terms of intelligence, but they still have this connection to their ancient past.
There's also the idea though that they may not have degenerated. Like I was having a think about it, and I was thinking, imagine, okay, we're all humans, right? We live in a society, and there's a bunch of other like beast races. There's elves. There's this. There's that. If we became the outcasts, and then they sent us out to live into the wild for thousands of years, we would degenerate into a pretty tribal state as well, with no technology. Like our teachings and things would eventually like get watered down. For 1,000 years, everything you know is when you see one of the other races, they attack you and think that you're big and scary.
I think it definitely is that, because it is indicated more so in ESO. Like if you kind of look at the Minotaurs in Oblivion, they're kind of like big and goofy looking, but the ESO Minotaurs are the ones I prefer. I think look much better, and you see lots of they wear armor, they have weapons, and they're also kind of smithed and so on. But you even have like the Minotaur Domerhouse, the Bloody Horned, who made a deal with, I'm pretty sure that's the Dreadhorn clan of Reachman and so on, and sort of organized this whole like taking of Folkreath kind of thing. Like they are, you know, they're not dumb beasts. They can conceive of a plan to take over over a city and alliances and stuff like that. And they have clans. The other thing I also like is that the highest, most powerful Minotaurs are called Minotaur Lords. But I also like that Minotaur Lord, like kind of thinking way back to the Elysian Empires, of these Minotaurs in high positions, that it's kind of like a title that's passed down from that kind of idea.
That's cool. I never thought about it like that. But yeah, 100% agree. I mean, if you just think about any group that gets exiled that severely is going to have their attitudes and their personality changed over time. There's no avoiding it.
I'm pretty sure in Elder Scrolls Blades 2, there is a Minotaur around the arena area that you can actually talk to as well. That has conversation. And, you know, Minotaur shamans being there and so on indicates like, you know, a society, a culture that has some sort of religious aspects to it and so on.
They're quite similar to orcs in terms of their culture. Like you have a male with all the breeding rights, you have shamans. You know, for anyone to say their culture is primitive and that they're not an intelligent beast race would have to say the same about orcs in many respects.
Yeah.
Except they're not. So. They're obviously viewed as like integrated into society and whatnot. So, you know.
Yeah. Absolutely. But I just think there's such a... I really like when you think back what the early Elysian Empire would have been like, with like, you can imagine Elysia surrounded with a like, you know, royal guard of Minotaurs or something like that, you know, amongst her son and so on. And the idea of having a big Minotaur with the Amulet of Kings like Belhazer and so on, and then like it just feels like such an interesting like ancient place, and there would be Aelid nobles and stuff who helped, and like, I don't know, it's just such a cool place, and it's all jungle too. That'd be so cool.
You got to give it to Elysia though. She must have had a really good restoration mage at hand when she gave birth to Belhazer.
Well, they didn't born with horns.
Yeah, well, I even if they weren't, I'd still say it's slightly more taxing than the average human.
But they're not just
agree
boring
with
with horns like ripping out. But yeah. But I mean, to be honest, like if Morahouse is this just sort of quite literally a bull with wings, then even that could have been quite the sort of ordeal.
I mean, for sure. I mean, and that kind of would explain where the concept of the man bull comes from, right? Like if you have a bull and a human and you fuse them, for lack of better words, you get a man bull. You know, like if you have a man bull and a human, what makes Belazar different to Morehouse, I guess? Like,
I also love that Domerhouse, the big Minotaur warlord who allied with the Dreadhorden clan, had these like magical wings going on, which is kind of like a nod back to like Morehouse kind of feeling, if you know what I mean. Like it's just cool, and I really love the idea of Elysia and Morehouse kind of being the center of their mythology. This is a little headcanon stuff, but like it's just something that's distinct from the other groups, because Morehouse, I mean, he's not really talked about anymore in Imperial mythology and so on. They got kind of simplified and boring. I feel like originally he was supposed to be, but I guess not. But you know.
I like the idea as well when the Aelids are warring against the Elysians. You've got Morahouse, the winged man bull representing Cain, and then you have Umriel, the unfeathered, who's kind of the leader of the other side. So it's kind of the feathered versus unfeathered aspect to the war.
Yeah, that's cool. That's cool. But I think we're ready to move on.
The last thing I was just going to say is I love the quote, "We are Ada more, and change things through love. We must take care lest we beget more monsters on this earth. If you do not desist, she will take to you, and you will transform all of Cyrodiil if you do this." Which is kind of like, so...
That's Pelinor's warning, right?
Yeah, it's Pellinor talking to Morahouse. So that's kind of about Elysia. So it's kind of like the product of their thing, like transforming all of Cyrodiil. It's just kind of an interesting sort of idea that the Minotaurs, like the very tangible, like you've changed the world kind of effects. And I wonder if, you know, having the Minotaurs there is what caused problems with the Elysian Order, like back and forth, and maybe helped the Elysian Order. I don't know. You know what I mean?
Yeah, it's hard to say because
Like
it
the
almost
stigma
seems
against
like
them.
it didn't make a big impact, but you can't know based on.
Well, I
like,
mean,
the
if you were to
butterfly
throw it-
effect could do anything.
Well, I mean, it did make a big impact in the way that their child became the new emperor and they started an empire, kind of.
Oh,
together.
right. Sorry. I'm more talking about how now Minotaurs exist. It's like, okay.
Oh, yeah, the Minotaurs are around as well.
They're
but
there.
yeah.
But yeah. I'm ready to talk about the Sload. This has been a long
right.
podcast, way longer than I thought.
Yeah.
The Sload, the slug-like beast
Yeah.
folk living in the coral kingdoms of Thras. These are, I could safely say, an evil race, at least by our interpretation. Like
They just don't have the same human, mammalian sort of concerns, it seems. Like it's rooted in their, even the way they treat their young and biology.
they have no empathy and they kill their children for soap. It's
Yeah.
it's quite iniquitous. But I know it's not done with that mindset of like, ha ha ha, I'm so evil.
Yeah.
It's just everything is for personal gain. So they'll honor laws and loyalties so long as it aids them. The second it doesn't, it's like, yeah, don't care anymore.
For sure. And they're really interesting. I like, one of my favorite things about the Sload, who are really disgusting, but I like how in all of their traditions and their myths and tales, instead of focusing on some hero that, you know, does some big brave thing and takes big risks, it's completely the opposite. All of their heroes are like careful planners who are really diligent and play the long game, and you know, they're really methodical, and all of their villains are the ones who are kind of hasty, and that's why ultimately these Sload heroes win, because they were careful, calculated, and planned.
Yeah.
Which I think is kind of how they perceive the races of Tamriel. There's the story that the after the Thrashan plague came and wiped out half of the population of Tamriel. So as vengeance, the humans gathered the Ulflag's navy to go over and just mess up the Coral Kingdoms, and that was, God, I need to get the exact date, but it's a long time ago now.
It was like 2,200 or something in the first era.
First era, yeah. So it's been a long time, and I just imagine that, you know, as you just said, Michael, the way they're very methodical and they plan and plan and plan. The amount of time that's passed since then is nothing for them. They're still planning their vengeance
because they have civilizations underneath the water, and there's even this idea that when Thras was kind of sunk, that was part of their plan, that they may have made a pact with like Molag Bal or something, and as it did its whirlwind spiral down under the sea, it was actually like a defense mechanism and not them being defeated. And then since then, you know, it comes back and like they're all sweet.
I do love, just before we leave the part about the mythology, but the Sload language having no word for adventure, and the closest equivalent is tragic disaster.
Yeah.
But yeah, so the Sload, like, I mean, Sload are they're a funny one for me because I really, really loved them in the Morrowind concept art that never really made it. And I think, I'm not sure if it's still in the lore or if it's just mentioned in stuff about them basically getting hordes of slaves from the Dunmer. They would buy lots and lots of slaves from the Dunmer and then take them back to do their necromancy sort of things on them and so on. But like there were these cool like concept arts called of like, I think it was like Grub Lord or something, and I had like this big sort of like mask and stuff on, like this big sort of it looks like something straight out of Star Wars, like some sort of
They had airships as well, you know. Like some rumors that they have airships carrying corpses from Centaur to Thras, which benefits them because they are super involved with necromancy. They can use all magic, but necromancy tends to be their area of expertise.
Yeah.
And they have no problems doing it. They have no problems with anything as long as it helps them reach their goals, basically. Zero moral concerns.
And the two thing, like with the whole idea that they don't have like good graspers, they can't like grab things. So using magic to like kind of naturally how like magic is so intertwined with them because it assists their very like physical functions even.
Well, apparently they can actually climb up walls and surfaces like slugs, like sticky, like they stick to it and just, you know.
But like I don't think we've seen any Sload that don't use magic. Like they're all like they don't have weapons like conventional swords and stuff like that. But I mean, look at them; they don't really.
They don't need them.
You know.
I mean, go check out our video, The Fattest Race in the Elder Scrolls, or do you know the fattest race in the Elder Scrolls? That was a fun video. That was a really fun video. The Sload have well, at least we don't know for sure, but they seem to have a really strange way of reproducing. So they're believed to be hermaphrodites in their youth, though the sexual organs seem to be absorbed by the time they are old enough to survive on land. I've also heard some story like of them going into the water and almost leaving their genitals on land or something, and then coming back later to get them. There's some weird stuff.
Thras, like the way it's like Thras is this giant, like what's described are these like called atolls, which are like these sort of like big beach, kind of like there'll be like it's like a thin strip of beach, but like almost a ring or something but water kind of gets into the middle. So there's like these shallow pools and stuff in between, and that's where a lot of their breeding and creating new creatures, new Sload, like baby Sload, happens in there. And but it's interesting that they all coexist in this kind of big pool, but the Sload that are lucky enough to survive, or good enough, I don't know, but they get out, but then they come back and then they just sort of like use the Sload soap and like, you know, make the babies into like soap and stuff. Like there's no care for it, you know what I mean? It's just the survival of the luckiest or fittest, whoever gets out, and then they just...
Well, and it's not just soap to be clean though. The soap is used in their...
Magic,
like that's super weird. I just found the quote of we do know, however, that the Sload of Thras are hermaphrodites in their youth, and later reabsorb their reproductive organs once they are old enough to move about on land. So that's really, really strange. I feel like it would be one of the most disgusting, creepy, slimy societies to visit. You wouldn't want to touch anything there.
No. They're also like atheist in the sense that the Dwemer are also like atheist or whatever. They don't worship any gods or have any religious sort of reverence for these, but they'll make pacts with Daedra for their own benefit, just as anyone else could. But also there's the example of Nagasta in the Redguard game that is following the King of Worms, which is Manamako. But this is because, necromancy,
and they'll trick people as well. There's this idea that while they don't have emotions, they can teach themselves to emote in the same way as the other races in order to kind of gain favor with them and to be more relatable, while when really they're not. And
it's interesting too. There is so Thras sunk and so on, but there's also what you experience in the Somerset Isles of the sea Sload, which kind of look a little bit different, and they were from completely underwater. They're Ulvor Kus, which is their the home of the sea Sload, but they're known to be even more reclusive than their Thracian cousins. So, and it's interesting that they've, in addition to necromancy, they have the skilled arts of alchemy, shadow magic, and mind magic. I don't know what mind magic
that could just
exactly.
be illusion, couldn't it?
Well, the thing with shadow, maybe, but shadow magic, interestingly, is like a reference to the stuff in Shadow Key. Remember, which is it's something you don't hear about much, but it's cool that they're into that. I also wonder though, it depends how far deep underneath the water they are, but it can get pretty dark deep beneath the ocean. I wonder how many shadows there actually are, because it kind of all just becomes darkness after a while.
I'm sure they could throw up a bunch of mage light kind of orbs, just throw them everywhere under the water. But
it's funny that when you conceptualize underwater kingdoms, you usually think of being able to see it clearly, like some Little Mermaid Atlantis looking thing, but instead the reality is deep in the ocean. It's really, really dark.
Well, they're called really reclusive, but they spend a lot of time raiding the shore. Well, not raiding, but attacking the shores of Somerset as well. And they made relations with the Malma of Pyandania and whatnot. So they don't seem terribly reclusive, at least for long stretches of time where they're attacking.
Yeah, true. And they do have the Yagra, these sort of crustacean-y sort of soldiers and stuff that they use as well, which also implies more let's raid more, let's attack more. And I mean, they did create, and not the sea Sload specifically, but the ones of Thras did, make a whole plague to wipe out 50% of people.
Yeah, the Thracian plague, that's it.
And they were pretty...
Yeah, but they didn't have to do anything. They could just send it on its way and just chill.
I wonder what their end game was there. What was the point?
Yeah, that's the weird thing, is understanding their motivations.
Yeah.
For anyone but themselves.
Just more corpses for necromancy. I don't know.
But I feel like they could get that already through the Dunmer slavery or the big corpses or you know what I mean?
I mean, look,
Plus, if you make everyone a corpse, you won't have any corpses for very long. You got to have living people to create the corpses, if that makes sense.
Yeah, I don't know. Maybe they just wanted to, just a little test, a little experiment, see how much damage they could do. I don't know.
Because
they were worried about overpopulation, I think.
But they've got their own kin. I don't know, man. It feels like a... Yeah, I don't know, because it just bit them in the ass. That's all that happened, really. I
mean, one thing that's interesting that be interested to hear your opinions on is this idea of this great tower that the All Flags Navy saw when they attacked. So here's a line about it. Our first view of the largest island was awe-inspiring. A tower taller than any I've ever seen and made of blood-red coral reached into the sky. A terrible blue light flickered at its apex like a strange bud upon the tower's stalk. And people have theorized that this is some kind of portal to oblivion, which I'm not so sure about, but there's some interesting theories surrounding it.
For sure, that could have just been when I was talking about Thras sinking and that potentially being part of the plan, it didn't actually sink.
Right.
It could be the tower flashes with this light and activates, and then they just go, see you later.
Right, so they just kind of retracted it under the ocean rather than it actually being destroyed and sank? Is that what you're getting at? Yeah.
They did. The All Flags Navy did slaughter a whole bunch of them, though.
For sure. They took damage.
I think,
100%.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I don't know.
Yeah. Well, it says here, the blue light atop the coral tower began to pulse and bleed energy into the sky, and it was just then that it started to quake and tremble and sink. So it almost seems like they're pressing their remote control and bringing their land under the ocean.
It could also be because they used magic or whatever to sink it, right? Was what the All Flags Navy. So what I'm saying is that pulsing could be the life force kind of the coral or whatever, the magical construct that helps it up, and because that starts pulsing and so on, it's about to like defunct and sink, you know what I mean?
It could be, but at the same time, I don't know, maybe I'm underplaying the power of Tamrielic mortals, but the idea that they actually have powerful magics to sink it that way, to me it seems almost more like a Sload ploy to be like, oh no, you've outsmarted us, but we're kind of just retreating essentially, and that's it. But I don't really have any evidence to support it.
Hasn't Thras since risen?
It sounds familiar.
The theory, yeah.
Well,
so I mean that works with the theory.
Because if so, then
yeah, Thras has since risen again, which is.
But does that could also
in the pocket guide?
But that could also be like, I'm all down for the idea that it was intentional, but it could also be that they, by Thras risen again, like built it again, like the tower.
Yeah.
Like,
yeah,
who
could
knows?
be.
But I think what you're saying, Scott, is actually the more accepted theory, that they were just sunk and defeated. I just wanted to provide some alternative facts.
The Sload would want it to be the accepted theory, wouldn't they?
Yeah, true.
I guess.
Yeah.
I feel like I feel like the Sload are they are criminally underused. They should have. It would have been so cool to see them in Morrowind, and like I don't know.
Yeah, like just a few of them.
Yeah. The whole idea of I like them when they play up their interact. Because they do this a lot with a lot of races. Outside of the playable ones, it's like all the other races are just evil and attack you and they're enemies. You don't really see the civil interactions as much, which would you know what I mean? Like, oh, the Sload enemy, here it is. It's like I'd love to see some more of the non-playable races in positions where you can interact with them as NPCs and stuff. Like, and I feel like that's fair. Like, people wouldn't. I mean, at least I wouldn't expect to be able to play a Sload in Elder Scrolls 6, but I would still like to see a Sload character in Elder Scrolls 6 that's not just an enemy.
You can get some slug mechanics going on. Go up on the roof upside down, start spell casting.
Yeah, I don't think they're that fast, though.
Who knows? But yeah, I agree.
I think they've been said to be slow. Kind of in the same way that...
It's in the name, man.
Yeah, well, in the same way as their like, even their whole like philosophy is slow and patient, but that's why they kind of use like magic to
essentially levitate their way around.
Well, that's all I've got to say on the lesser known beast races. Do you two have anything else to add before we wrap this up?
No,
I think we've hit a good stopping point. It's gone on for a long time.
Well, thanks everyone.
Heaven help.
It's been fun.
Heaven help us if we missed any.
But thanks for watching, and let us know in the comments what we missed and what you want to hear more about. Remembering the criteria that we want it to kind of be like a lesser known beast race, not necessarily like a cursed thing. Does it breed? Does it lay eggs? Things like that are really interesting. But yeah, thank you so much. Social media links are in the description, and we look forward to nerding out with you all again very soon.